Recording in progress.
Aloha mai kākou e nā po'e who are attending this Indigenous Press Freedom Challenges Top Story session with Bryan.
From Associated Press, Native American Journalists Association, and former John S. Knight Fellow, Stanford University.
O Jordan Kalabai o Baku Nunes Ko'u.
O Amy Hi'ilave Neves Ko'ui no Hiha. We are both journalism students here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. We are also Kanaka Oiwi, whose ancestors come from the Aina of Waimanalo.
And Hilo Hawaii. Some of my family names include Nunez and Kalabaita.
Some of my family names include Nevis, Saragena, and Mitchell. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the Aina on which we gather is the University of Hawaii at Manoa.
The University of Hawaii at Manoa occupies the Mokopuni of Oahu in the Ahupua'a of Waikiki, in the Ili Aina of Punahou, Kolowalu, Pa'akea, Pilipili, Wailele, Pamoa, Huahia, Kawala'a, Kipawai, Pili'amo'o, and Kanewai.
The land that the University of Hawaii at Manoa resides on is part of the larger territory recognized by the indigenous Hawaiians as their ancestral grandmother, Papahanaumoku. We recognize that Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani yielded the Hawaiian kingdom and these territories under duress and protect to the United States to avoid the bloodshed of her people. We further recognize that Hawaii remains an illegally occupied state of America.
We acknowledge that each moment we are here in Hawaii, she nourishes and gifts us and every other person here with the opportunity to breathe her air, eat from her soils, drink from her waters, bathe in her sun, swim in her oceans, be kissed by her rains, and be embraced by her winds.
We further recognize that generations of our ancestors' knowledge shaped Hawaii in sustainable ways for all of us to enjoy these gifts today. For this, we are grateful as Kanaka Oiwi. We recognize our kuleana, both our responsibilities as well as our dear privileges to care for this Aina and for many generations yet to come.
We also recognize our kuleana to invite each of you to help us in this most important endeavor, and we do so at this time. Mahalo.
Thank you all for coming today, and I'm so pleased that I finally got Bryan here. He was supposed to come in March 2020, and then COVID hit, and we still had his check ready for him, so I had to pay his way out here. So thank you, Bryan, for coming today. And he is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and he's the Grant Operations Manager at the Associated Press. He's lived in California, and he was formerly president of NAJA, the Native American Journalists Association. He's those departments for supporting us today. And I want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Beth Keever, who's here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Beth is a legend in the state. Just about every reporter in the state had taken her class, especially in investigative public affairs reporting. She's written 2 books. One on Vietnam, her years covering the Vietnam War. And now she's also talking to Bryan because she's working on a documentary as well on Native Americans in Vietnam. Yes?
Thank you so much. Thank
Yes,
you.
Thank you for making the effort, everybody.
Thank you, Ann, and happy World Press Freedom Day.
Right.
I think it's appropriate that we do this presentation. So as Ann Ann said in my introduction, I'm the former executive editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, and while I was at the Cherokee Phoenix, I learned quite a bit about not only the history of the Phoenix, but also the rich diversity and power of indigenous media really across Indian country, mostly within the United States, the continental United States. And we'll be talking a little bit about that during the presentation. I was also president and then the associate director of the Native American Journalists Association, where we launched the Red Press Initiative, among other programs, to better understand how indigenous communities in the U.S. experience or not preservation. I took those studies from NAJA into my fellowship at Stanford, and expanded it by examining tribal constitutions and how tribes have enshrined the rights to free press and speech in their foundational documents. And I'll go over some of that research as well. But most importantly, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, which is where our story begins, as we learn more about the values of indigenous free press. So here we see the ancestral home.
Okay, now that the world can hear me with my microphone on, here we see the ancestral homeland of the Ani Yunwea, or the Cherokee people. Before colonization, our homelands encompass parts of what are now 8 U.S. states in the southeastern U.S. Prior to the American Revolution, Cherokees for decades had mostly peaceful trade relations with the British and formed an alliance with them during the American Revolution. This alliance was ill-fated, though, for both the British and the Cherokee, and after devastating losses to the Continental Army, Cherokees were forced into several major land cessions to forge a tentative peace with the new American government. But the peace after those land cessions was short-lived. The tribe, under constant pressure to relinquish more and more lands, ceded nearly 4 million more acres. By the 1820s, the Cherokee homelands had dwindled, and the tribe was still under constant attack from the state of Georgia and its paramilitary Georgia militia, which conducted constant terrorist operations against Cherokee people and communities in an effort to drive the remaining Cherokees from their lands. It's in this environment that we see the birth of the Cherokee Phoenix. For the Cherokee Phoenix to launch, really 3 elements had to come together. The Cherokee language, which had been an oral language for time immemorial, had been developed into a written syllabary in 1821 by a Cherokee named Sequoyah. Second, a missionary, Samuel Worcester, who lived among the Cherokees for about 34 years, seized upon this new syllabary as an instrument to further the Christian message. He also used his connection with the mission in Boston to help acquire a new printing press and to cast a custom set of Cherokee typeface for the press.
Bryan, could you speak louder? I think it's a little quiet back here.
Okay,
Because they've only mic'd you on Zoom.
okay. Can you guys hear me back there when I'm kind of at this level? Okay, great.
Thanks, Bryan.
All right. And third, a young Cherokee man named Elias Boudinot, who had a vision for the potential of an independent Cherokee newspaper. The Cherokee Nation Council authorized the purchase of the press and selected Boudinot as its editor. Boudinot was born in Cherokee Nation, but left at a young age to be educated at the Foreign Mission School in Connecticut. He believed that a newspaper could be a powerful tool to quiet the rising cacophony of non-Indigenous voices clamoring for Indigenous and Cherokee removal. We can glean some insights into this belief from a speech he made in Philadelphia while trying to raise support for this new endeavor. He said, "To obtain a correct and complete knowledge of these people," meaning Cherokees, "there must exist a vehicle of Indian intelligence, altogether different from those which have heretofore been employed. Will not a paper published in an Indian country under proper and judicious regulations have the desired effect?" He went on to say, "If the general," meaning the federal government, "continue its protection and the American people assist them in their humble efforts, they must rise." And so we see those words symbolized in the logo for the Cherokee Phoenix. Under the banner of protection, symbolizing the protection of the federal government, the Cherokee people can rise. And that the Phoenix symbolizes the Cherokee people. The paper featured articles on farming practices and a series on natural history. It published the Cherokee Constitution and laws, political announcements of district candidates for national council seats, and a poetry corner. Likely as a result of missionary sponsorship and the fact that Boudinot had been educated among missionaries, the Phoenix was also laced with Christian morality, an editorial prerogative that was not always welcomed by the tribal government, which still governed a majority of Cherokee non-Christian traditionalists. Most significant, though, were its political editorials. They exhorted against the abuses Cherokees suffered from white settlers and poachers, and the attacks sponsored by the Georgia government and perpetrated by the Georgia militia. In its early years, the Phoenix played an essential role in providing the truth to Cherokee people, while also reinforcing the Cherokee language. But Boudinot knew what he was up against. In the inaugural issue of the Phoenix in 1828, he wrote, we will now commit our feeble efforts to the goodwill and indulgence of the public, hoping that for that happy period when all Indian tribes of America shall rise, Phoenix-like, from the ashes, and when the terms Indian depredation, war whoop, scalping knife, and the like shall become obsolete and forever be buried deep underground. The attacks against Cherokees were fueled by stereotypes and misinformation perpetrated about indigenous people, including Cherokees, from the beginning of American colonialism. This kind of negative imagery shaped the perception of Native peoples, and those perceptions fueled the policies of genocide and Indian removal. In this editorial cartoon, we read, "Arise, Columbia's sons and forward press, your country's wrongs call loudly for redress. The savage Indian with his scalping knife or tomahawk may seek to take your life." Fear-mongering was essential to cultivating public support for mass theft of Indian lands and the extinguish of indigenous people and culture. Negative representations of indigenous people are part of the Western Hemisphere's colonial history, and earlier representations of indigenous people are intimately tied to the process of colonization. The first Thanksgiving seen here is a painting. It uses some creative staging to show desired power dynamics, including the placement of indigenous people on the ground with dogs and children. This painting from 1872 depicts Columbia, the white female embodiment of the United States and the values of liberty, leading white settlers into the West and pushing indigenous people into the darkness. This image symbolizes manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was ordained by God to spread Christianity. White patriarchy and individual liberties to every corner of North America and beyond. Manifest Destiny was supported by the Catholic Church's doctrine of discovery, the belief that any lands uninhabited by Christians were available for discovery and conquest. These early representations should be viewed as foundational colonial principles created for a singular purpose: to manufacture support for the destruction, exploitation, and erasure of indigenous people, and the control, conquest, and exploitation of their lands and resources. The clamor for Cherokee lands and the violent attacks on Cherokee communities continued unabated. The Phoenix continued to provide knowledge to the Cherokee people about these threats. The success of the Phoenix in distributing this truth about these threats was ultimately its downfall. When the Phoenix provided detailed information about the impending removal of the Cherokees to the west, the Georgia militia raided the Phoenix office, confiscated and destroyed the press, and dumped the Cherokee typeface down a well. In 1830, just a few years after the Phoenix launched, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, ushering in the Indian removal era and the final violent dispossession of Cherokees from the remaining lands in the East. The Cherokee people followed several paths known as the Trail of Tears to reach new lands in the West, the Indian Territory. More than 4,000 Cherokees, including elders, women, and children, died on this journey. Despite these hardships, the Cherokee people and Cherokee Nation persevered. In 1839, about a decade after removal, the nation enacted its second constitution. They also passed a series of laws, and in these we find the earliest example of an explicit press protection by an Indian nation. Importantly, it expressly empowers the editor to use their discretion in all matters to manage the newspaper in a way that will benefit the Cherokee Nation. In October 1843, just a few years after the passage of this Constitution, the Cherokee National Council authorized the creation of a new newspaper, the Cherokee Advocate. The first issue was published in September 1844 with the motto, "Our rights, our country, our race." The paper was printed weekly in both Cherokee and English to provide tribal members with information on the proceedings of the National Council and its negotiations with the U.S. government, messages from the principal chief, reports on the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, missionary activities, and other local news. But by 1844, it wasn't the only game in town. Baptist missionary Jotham Meeker established a press at the Baptist Mission in Kansas in 1834. He began printing a newspaper in the Shawnee language. Meeker, with the help of interpreters Joseph DeShane and a Shawnee named Blackfeather, developed a method by which the sounds or syllables of the Shawnee language were represented by letters of the English alphabet. The Shawnee Sun was the first periodical publication to be printed in what is now Kansas, and possibly the first to be printed entirely in a Native American language. It dissolved in 1844, it is said, due to limited readership. The publication was significant because, despite its missionary purpose, it was published entirely in the Shawnee language. Language reinforcement is an important role of an indigenous press. In 1886, the first newspaper published on a reservation by its own citizens in Minnesota appeared under the title The White Earth Progress. The Progress was significant due to the founding vision of its Anishinaabe publisher, Gus Below, and his cousin and its editor, Theodore Below, both citizens of the tribe. It was a weekly English language paper that vehemently advocated for the political interests of the White Earth Reservation. Shockingly, its debut was short-lived when the local federal Indian agent, a non-Indigenous representative of the federal government, unhappy with the paper's criticism, seized the press and ordered the publisher off the reservation. To be clear, the federal Indian agency was not there to advocate for these communities. They were there to ensure implementation of federal policy on these communities. After a U.S. Senate subcommittee decided that distributing the paper was a lawful occupation without the need for surveillance and restrictions by the local Indian agent, the Progress resumed publication more than a year later. Re-energized, its publisher continued to challenge the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the local Indian agent. The paper provided analysis of the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887 and published scathing front-page editorials questioning the purpose of the Indian agency. As you can see here in the first paper that they launched, they also were not afraid to call out the Indian agent for its censorship of the paper. It also published articles dedicated to local history and stories from an Anishinaabe perspective. In its final issue in July 1889, the publisher explained that it had to suspend publication while negotiations about the allotment of tribal lands were taking place between the U.S. Commission and the Tribal Council. This is another example of an indigenous press undermined by shifting federal policies, this time the burgeoning policy of land allotment. Meanwhile, the Advocate, the Cherokee Advocate, was still publishing since its inception in 1844. It had been publishing weekly with several breaks due to financial difficulties and a fire, but demonstrated significant resilience to continue publishing despite obstacles. It ceased publication, however, in 1906 when the Cherokee Nation government was dissolved by the U.S. government, one of many casualties during the failed policy experiment known as the allotment era. On February 8, 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, also known as the General Allotment Act, a law that authorized the president to break up reservation land, which was held in common by all members of the tribe, into small allotments to be parceled out to individuals. Federal Indian policy during the allotment era marked a departure from earlier policies that were dominated by annihilation, removal, treaties, and reservations. The new policy focused on breaking up tribal lands, granting allotments to individual Native Americans, and encouraging them to take up agriculture. And you can see in this map, all these red spots are the individual allotments that were parceled out to the citizens of the tribe. This ill-conceived policy of assimilation and its effects have had disastrous consequences on our identities, cultures, ecologies, food systems, governance, and self-determination that persist to this day. Between 1916 and 1922, Wasaha was founded and self-published by a Yavapai Apache doctor and activist who was born Wasaha, but later assumed the westernized name Carlos Montezuma. He received his doctorate in medicine in 1889, becoming the first indigenous person to receive a medical degree in the United States. Later, he became an activist for Native American rights and was a founder of the Society of American Indians in 1911. Montezuma was an intellectual leader and was notorious for advocating an end to the reservation system and the abolishment of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Wasaha, which translates to signaling or beckoning, was a powerful platform for Montezuma's views on education, activism, and life under federal rule. In the first issue, Montezuma wrote, "Wasaha's sole purpose is freedom for the Indians through the abolishment of the Indian Bureau. So what we have seen now through basically this first century of an indigenous press is that despite considerable turmoil and hardships, the indigenous press have elevated indigenous voices and perspectives and played a critical role in enforcing language, culture, and being responsible to the needs of their communities as purveyors of truth and knowledge. So this is our first of a couple of breaks, and if I take a couple of questions now, if anyone has anything about all of that.
During the allotment period in particular, where did the folks who were doing this writing go when these presses shuttered? Is there a history of like where these publishers, like, is there underground work being done?
Not that I
know of, and I haven't really researched that. I wish I had a better answer for you, but that would be an interesting thing to look into, kind of what was happening during these dark periods after the papers had been closed. That's a good question. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Sorry, I have a question. Can I what was the date that the first newspaper was published again?
1828.
And when that newspaper was published, was it strictly in that mother tongue, or was it still with English Chew at that
It
time?
was English and Cherokee.
Okay.
And some of the articles, most of them were published bilingually, meaning that there would be like an English version in one column and the Cherokee version in the next column.
And then that was the Phoenix one, right?
The Cherokee Phoenix, yeah. The Cherokee Advocate was also published bilingually.
Bilingually, okay.
Yeah.
Was there ever a newspaper that was published strictly in Cherokee during that time period?
During that time period, not to my knowledge, but the Cherokee Phoenix still publishes today, and they do, I believe annually, they publish an issue that is exclusively in Cherokee.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Tell them the story that you told me about how you ended up working for the Cherokee Phoenix and your grandmother's influence.
Yeah, so I was
Raised off reservation, meaning I didn't grow up in the Cherokee Nation, but my grandmother, who was Cherokee, always instilled that identity in her grandchildren. It was very important to her that we learned that and that we understood that about ourselves. And so one of the things that she did when I went to college was she subscribed for me to receive the Cherokee Phoenix while I was at the university. And so that was actually my first contact with the Cherokee Phoenix. And as it happened, years later after I graduated and started my own career in journalism, I knew about the Cherokee Phoenix. And so when I wanted to move back to Oklahoma, that was the first place that I looked for work. And sure enough, they hired me as a photojournalist. That was my entry point into the Cherokee Phoenix. So the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, after a series of meetings with Native American leaders, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs set forth a proposed federal bill for granting self-government to tribes. It marked the first time Native American communities were asked for input in the structuring of American Indian relations with federal and state governments. The Indian Reorganization Act reversed the policy of Indian assimilation that we saw during the allotment era and ended the land allotment system. It permitted tribes to establish formal governments, and in so doing, also provided tribal governments an opportunity to enshrine rights to freedoms of speech and press. So we'll see some examples of that now. And this is the research that I did while I was at Stanford. So here's an early example of a press protection from the Blackfeet tribe. And it provides a really broad affirmation. It states, all members of the tribe shall enjoy without hindrance freedom of worship, conscience, speech, press, assembly, and association. This shall enjoy without hindrance language explicitly affirms and protects a free press, among other rights for all tribal citizens. I refer to this language as an affirmative protection. And bookmark that because I'll be returning to it in a little while. Others, like the Constitution adopted by the Pueblo of Santa Clara in the same year, provide for a guarantee of individual rights already provided by the United States. I refer to this as a deferred protection, meaning the Constitution itself is not guaranteeing the rights, but it is saying that it will uphold rights already granted by another sovereign nation, in this case, the United States Constitution. It's a deferred protection. And yet another early example from an Alaska Native village. It says, members of the village shall have the right to speak and meet together freely in a peaceable way. While not an explicit free press protection, the enshrinement of the rights to speech and assembly are intertwined with freedom of the press. I refer to this as an implied protection, meaning that the language could be interpreted to imply press protection, though it's not an explicit protection. The Navajo Tribal Council overwhelmingly approved this constitution in 1953. However, the U.S. government claimed that certain provisions were inconsistent with federal law. This constitution was never adopted. Whatever the objection, it likely wasn't this section found in its Bill of Rights. It states, the Navajo Tribal Council shall make no law abridging freedom of religion, of speech, the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition for redress of grievances. Sound familiar? This language is very consistent with the U.S. First Amendment. The Navajo Times started in 1959, just a few years after that Constitution was written, as a monthly newspaper published by the Education Committee of the Navajo Tribe in Window Rock, Arizona, the capital of the Navajo Nation. Dylan Platero, chairman of the Tribal Council's Education Committee, was the first editor and publisher. The inaugural issue stated, quote, the primary purpose of the newspaper is to serve the 6,000 Navajo children who are attending off-reservation schools. It is hoped that this newspaper will keep them informed about what is happening on their reservation. It is also hoped that this is a step towards supplying the Navajo people with an ever-increasing flow of information.
Sorry, could you say that again?
No, I'm just going to say it once. This paper was started explicitly to reinforce Navajo culture and identity to students living off the reservation and to provide knowledge to the Navajo people. The Times became a weekly starting in April 1961, with the tribe listed as publisher and the front page headline, Navajo Times, now Tribal Enterprise. The newspaper's relationship with the tribal government, which funded and oversaw its operations for many years, sometimes created tension between its editors and the council, the Navajo government. Chet McCrory was editor of the Times from 61 to 64, but he resigned when he felt that the tribal council was attempting to control the news. McCrory was later rehired to the paper, and in February 1966 opinion, he wrote, with this issue of the Navajo Times, the newspaper takes its first step as a free press by resolution of the Navajo Tribal Council. The resolution directed the Times to report activities of the tribal government, quote, without censorship or fear of reprisals from administrative superiors whose interests may be adversely affected by truthful reporting. This Navajo law empowered an indigenous free press and the truthful reporting by the Navajo Times. During the Civil Rights era, Native people and groups like the American Indian Movement were concerned about rights violations perpetrated by federal and state authorities. Some of these concerns were addressed in the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as ICRA. It included an Indian Bill of Rights that stated in its first section, no Indian tribe in exercising powers of self-government shall make or enforce any law prohibiting the free exercise of religion or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition for a redress of grievances. This language is very similar to the language that we saw in the unratified Navajo Nation Constitution just about 15 years prior. There are many examples of tribal constitutions adopting this type of press protection language, including this constitution that was adopted in December of 1968, just a few months after the passage of ICRA. This shall not prohibit language, although similar to First Amendment protection, is not a broad affirmation of press freedom like examples of affirmative protections that we saw prior to ICRA. I refer to this as a limited protection because it only protects against a statutory prohibition of speech or press. Those of us that have worked in indigenous media know that there are many things that a tribal government or tribal authorities can do to suppress or obstruct free speech and free press that don't involve passing a law prohibiting it. That's why I refer to this as a limited protection. So in my research of constitutions, I saw kind of these, a lot of similarities of language among constitutions. And so I decided maybe I should just take a snapshot of tribal constitutions, and let's see kind of what these protections really look like, from basically the weakest protections to the strongest protections. And this is what I found. About, of the 100 constitutions that I looked at, about 18% are silent, meaning they really don't mention press freedom at all. They don't really have any language that protects free speech or free press. About 16% have that implied protection that I mentioned earlier, meaning that they do expressly protect speech and assembly, but they don't explicitly protect press. It's an implied protection. About 24% have that deferred protection I mentioned earlier, meaning they don't explicitly protect it, but they say if it's protected under the US laws, we'll honor it. And then about 30% have the limited protection, which is the language that's very similar to the First Amendment, stating that tribal governments will not make or enforce any law prohibiting a free press. That leaves about 12% that have the language that I really like and prefer as a journalist, which is an affirmative protection. The tribe shall not, the tribal citizens shall enjoy without hindrance freedom of the press. That is a broad affirmative protection, and I believe that all tribal governments that are either silent or have a weaker protection should all move in the direction of establishing a more affirmative protection for an indigenous free press. So that was a lot. Any questions about tribal constitutions?
That's pretty dry.
It's not always fun lecturing about policy, but those of you that are interested in a career in journalism, I very much encourage you to become a policy wonk. So much of your reporting is going to rely on understanding the underlying policies that affect what people are doing, especially government. All right, so we'll move into our last section, which is kind of moving us into the modern era of an indigenous press. So after the passage of ICRA, we see a slow expansion of new tribal media outlets. Founded in 1971, just a couple of years after the passage of ICRA, KYUK was the first public, non-commercial radio station officially affiliated with a native tribe and serves a predominantly indigenous audience, namely the Yupik, and it's based in Bethel, Alaska. It's now the oldest continuously operating tribal radio station in the U.S. and broadcasts in Yupik and English. The Lakota Times was launched in 1981 in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, published by Oglala Lakota journalist Tim Gallego. In a 2005 article in Neiman Reports, he said, quote, "While working as a reporter for the Rapid City Journal, I was bothered by the fact that although I had been born and raised on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, I was seldom given an opportunity to do news stories about the people of the reservation. One editor told me that I would not be able to be objective in my reporting. I replied, 'All of your reporters are white. Are they objective when covering the white community?' The Lakota Times became Indian Country Today in 1992 to reflect its growing national pan-Indian audience. It's still published to this day and can be found at IndianCountryToday.com. Who's heard of Indian Country Today? Oh, you should check them out. IndianCountryToday.com. Launched in February 1983, KILI Radio was founded by members of the American Indian Movement. Located in Porcupine, South Dakota, it broadcasts to the Pine Ridge, Rosebud, and Cheyenne River reservations. It broadcasts in Lakota and English. So since ICRA, the Indian Civil Rights Act, we've really seen a proliferation of indigenous media across all platforms. Newspapers, radio, newsletters, websites, television stations and broadcasts, and of course, social media and podcasts. So you might think that with this rich history of an indigenous press going all the way back to 1828 in the first Cherokee Phoenix, and the presence, if not prevalence, of constitutional press protections, some stronger, some weaker, and the proliferation of modern indigenous media, you might conclude that an indigenous free press is a foregone conclusion. Not so fast. In 2015, the Native American Journalists Association launched the Red Press Initiative to better understand how press freedom is being experienced in indigenous communities. We surveyed both tribal media producers, people who are indigenous journalists working to report on their communities, and the tribal media audience, the consumers of that reporting. First, the good news. When asked, does your tribal media use your ancestral language? A big majority of 80% responded that at least some of the time their tribal media outlet does use their language. When asked, does your tribal media reinforce the cultural values of your tribe? Overwhelmingly, 95% responded that at least some of the time their tribal media does reinforce the cultural values of their tribe. And when asked, do you consider freedom of the press to be an important value at your tribe? Again, a large majority, 72%, responded yes. Freedom of the press is an important value of the tribe. Now the not so great news. Is tribal media required to seek prior approval from government officials before publishing? This is known as prior restraint. Any copy, any reporting has to be reviewed by a government official before being published. About a third of tribal media producers, the people out there doing the reporting, responded all or most of the time they have to get prior approval before publishing. Do stories about tribal affairs or tribal officials go unreported due to censorship? Almost a quarter of tribal media producers responded all or most of the time censorship is happening. But among consumers, the people who are consuming the media, interestingly, almost half responded that they don't know. This is a dangerous dichotomy to me. When you have at least almost a quarter of tribal media journalists reporting they're experiencing censorship, but you have almost half of the audience saying they don't even know that it's happening. Are tribal media staff subject to intimidation and harassment when covering tribal affairs? About half of tribal media producers said yes. When asked who is the source of the harassment, 53% responded elected officials, all or most of the time, and 50% responded senior officials of the tribe, all or most of the time. This also, to me, is a very dangerous numbers. And having worked in Indigenous press at the Cherokee Phoenix and having experienced my own harassment in the years that I worked there, having worked with my colleagues in Indigenous media and heard their stories, this is something that is still very prevalent today and needs to be addressed. And we have other anecdotal examples of this continuing to this day. This documentary film, Bad Press, just debuted at the Sundance Film Festival in January of this year. The film follows the struggle to reinstate press freedom after it was repealed by the tribal government, the Muskogee Creek Nation. In an act of resistance and resilience, the people rallied to support its free press and the Muskogee Creek journalists reporting on and for their communities. I encourage everyone to see this film. The Society of Professional Journalists just last month awarded the Black Hole Award to the Mark Fox administration of the 3 affiliated tribes, which is in North Dakota. Is anyone familiar with SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists? It's a national journalism organization. They famously have a code of ethics that journalists follow to help guide their reporting in an ethical way. So they're a national organization, and they have this Black Hole Award for any organization that, or individual, I suppose, that resists information. So to my knowledge, this is the first time that a tribal government was actually awarded the Black Hole Award, because the Mark Fox administration is so opaque that even citizens of that tribe do not have access to how that tribe operates or how the funds of that tribe are spent. So kind of bringing this all together after talking about, the history of the Indigenous press, what that what Indigenous press freedom really looks like and really means to those communities, why it's important, looking at the tribal constitutions and how they've enshrined press freedom, in some ways a little bit weaker, some ways much stronger, and then also just looking at the reality today based on our survey results and based on other things that we see happening. I believe that the Indigenous Free Press plays a vital and irreplaceable role in supporting Indigenous rights, community, and sovereignty. I believe there is still much work to be done to support an Indigenous press, but it's undeniable that they reinforce this set of values. Truth. An Indigenous free press should be a source of accurate information to its citizens. It should not be filtered through an administration or through some sort of political agenda. That truth then builds knowledge. Knowledge is absolutely essential to an Indigenous community and Indigenous people and families so that they can make decisions about how to handle sometimes turbulent and shifting political environments. Responsibility. An Indigenous press absolutely has responsibility to its audience. Unlike mainstream media, which sometimes when they're covering Indigenous affairs, they will parachute in and they will take what they need for their reporting. They will extract reporting from a community and then they take it and do what they want with it. Indigenous press and tribal media, they have a responsibility to their community, and it shows in their reporting. And that adds to its reciprocity with its community. What we see many times in Indigenous media is that it is a reciprocal relationship with its audience. They are in constant communication with their people so that they understand the needs of their community and are able to use the power of the press to further the wants and needs of that community. It is a reciprocal relationship. Identity. We have seen time and time again, going all the way back to the first Cherokee Phoenix, that tribal media reinforces language, it reinforces culture, and reinforces identity. It reminds the citizens of that community what it is to be a part of that community. And resilience. All of these things added together create a community with greater resilience. And without resilience, you cannot have self-determination. An Indigenous free press, guided by this ethic and this set of ethics, can and will support the dream of Indigenous self-determination. And with that, I conclude my lecture. Yeah.
I have a question, but why is the government still allowed to censor like information? And then what things are they trying to hide?
Those are very good
Questions. Starting with the first one, most tribal media, because they often work in very remote locations and have very small audiences, are not financially independent. They rely on the tribe to subsidize their budget, and because of that, the tribe thinks it should have some control over what tribal media does. Having some sort of statutory protection in place, whether it's in the Constitution or whether it's in laws, is absolutely essential to maintain the editorial independence that these organizations need. And so to answer your question, the reason that the tribes often kind of encroach on press freedom is because they fund it. They fund the operation, and so they feel like they have the prerogative to have some control over what they do. And then the second question was,
It was like what things are we trying to like hide out of the community?
It can be anything.
and I've heard examples of all kinds of stuff. Oftentimes it's how money is spent. If they get money from tribal operations, casinos and other operations, or if they get federal funding for different programs, money that comes in, if it's not being spent wisely or in the way that it's supposed to be spent, tribal governments don't want people to know about that. And so oftentimes when we see a lack of transparency, it's around how money is being spent. But it can be other stuff too. If there's any kind of malfeasance among tribal officials, or if they're doing something that's not above board, they don't want that appearing in the paper, right? And so it can be any number of things that they don't want the public to know about.
Okay, we've got three. We'll start over here on the right, all the way in the back.
You also, guys, can you say your name too?
Yes, my name is Tom, and I'm here, since I don't look like a student, I'm here as a guest of Ann's. I live here in Oahu. So first, thank you very much. You've covered a lot of ground, provided a lot of knowledge that many of us don't have. So thank you very much for that. Many years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing many elders with the purpose of asking them about what the elders' elders would be saying if they were still alive. Many of them reinforced this concern of press freedom, but others presented a perspective that I'd like your perspective on. That perspective is that journalism is a very, very tiny part of communion and communication, and that communication with animals, with ancestors, with tribal elders, with the universe is far more important than the tiny affairs of just a few human beings. And the Western paradigm of telling us what stories should be told that are called journalism, as opposed to really important stories. And that if there's a true function of journalism, it would be for that which the elders impart to be communicated to the larger world, not to clone and copy the institutional rigidities that basically support commercialism and other values. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think what makes indigenous media unique actually is that they don't have those rigidities. What we see when you really look across the landscape of indigenous media is a variety of journalism practice. I often refer to it actually as journalisms in the plural, because it can be a little bit different from community to community based on their specific beliefs about the role that that media should play in their community. And oftentimes that's dictated by traditions and by elders. As you probably also learned, there's much information that has no business being in the tribal newspaper, right? And I'm talking about sacred knowledge. And when you work in tribal media, I learned it when I was at the Cherokee Phoenix. I think that all tribal media experience this. There is a demarcation between the things that you should be reporting on, oftentimes the affairs of government, but sometimes there are cultural things, but there is a line between what that community recognizes as being okay to report under the auspices of journalism, and things that are completely off limits. And I think that's what's really unique about indigenous media, is that not only do they understand those boundaries, but they are still able to they're still able to practice journalism operating within kind of those restrictions in the community, and they honor those restrictions. One of the pitfalls of mainstream media is that when they come into a community to do reporting, they have no idea. And this is knowledge that is often, takes years to acquire if you're an indigenous journalist operating within the community. People who come in that have no cultural knowledge, they have no idea. And so it's very easy for them to cross those boundaries and to get basically sideways with the community because they've reported things that they believe are sacred and have no business appearing in the pages of the paper. To me, that's what is unique, truly, about Indigenous media, is that they know where those boundaries are. They know what belongs in the pages of the paper, but what is also sacred knowledge, and they honor that.
Thank you very much.
I have a question from, did someone else? This is from the chat. Someone else have a question on the floor? No. This is from Maya.
Go, you can go.
Okay, go ahead, Brandon.
Hi, my name is Brandon. Did you notice if any like blue states, red states, purple states maybe treat Indigenous press better than others?
So I've not really done an analysis of it from a
State perspective. Right. My analysis has really been from tribal community to tribal community, right? But to responding to your question, it's been a really wide variety. I mean, there are some tribes like the Mark Fox administration that got the Black Hole Award that absolutely will do anything in their power to suppress press freedom. But there are others that exalt it and lift it up and fully support it. The Navajo Nation, the Osage Nation. There are quite a few tribes. The Muskogee Creek Nation now, now that they've kind of been snapped back into place, they absolutely support it. And so we really see a pretty broad spectrum of support, really from community to community, and you kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
What etiquette or protocols should a non-native journalist use when they go into a sovereign nation of the tribal land?
That's a great question.
Whenever people ask about that, I always start with it begins with relationships.
With what?
Relationships. You need to develop a relationship with that tribe, with people in that tribe. Before you even think about reporting anything, you need to spend time in that community. You need to develop relationships with people. You basically need to foster trust and let that community understand that you have a sense of responsibility to that community, that you're just not coming in to steal their stories and then go off and use them for your own purposes. And so I recommend that everyone spend a substantial amount of time really cultivating those relationships in that community. And once you've fostered that sense of trust, then you can really start thinking about, okay, what kind of reporting can I do that's going to not only further that trust, but is going to show a sense of responsibility to that community.
Do you need permission from the leader of the tribal council to even begin this relationship?
That's going to vary from tribe to tribe. It's really going to depend on kind of what the system of authority is, for lack of a better term, in the tribe. Sometimes having acknowledgement from elders is enough. Sometimes there is an official body or a government body that you need to get permission from. It's really just going to vary from tribe to tribe, but that's where developing the relationships comes into play, because you can get a better understanding of what needs to be done before you can start reporting.
Thank you. That's very, very clear.
This is a question from Maya Satoro on chat. And she said, are there peace and justice stories from tribal media that have recently broken through into mainstream media? She's wondering about bridge building potential. So are there peace and justice stories from tribal media that have recently broken into mainstream media?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
We see actually some fantastic reporting coming from tribal media outlets within their communities. We see great reporting coming from some of these pan-Indian organizations like Indian Country Today and others. And we also see really great reporting coming from mainstream media that has dedicated themselves to doing great Indigenous affairs reporting, like High Country News, where I sit on the board of directors. It is really kind of, I would say, you can find it across Indian country, but to the point, it doesn't always percolate up into mainstream consciousness. And so I think there's still work to be done to build those bridges. I think that getting that kind of content to percolate up into a greater mainstream consciousness is important.
That's gonna be your job, right?
Yes.
With that, do you want to talk a little bit about your plans and dreams, and maybe also put up the Naja website?
Yeah, I hesitated to mention it in my response because I was about to go there, but because the project hasn't really launched, I don't know how deeply I want to get into it. But I am working on a project at the AP to develop much greater Indigenous affairs reporting and really using the vast reach of the Associated Press to really lift up Indigenous voices.
And not just North America, but reaching out to us here. So this is kind of the first step in this, right? Working out and reaching out globally. And then he's speaking in Sweden in September at a global Indigenous journalism conference, right?
Yep. There's gonna be a small cohort
Of us at the GIGN conference in Sweden, and we'll be talking about how we build bridges and relationships across Indigenous communities in the world to further our interests. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? And you can also come up and talk to Bryan after if you want to get a picture. Aaron here, thank you, Aaron, for joining and thank you, Lave and Kalavaya for your help today. And thank you, Tom Cooper, and very esteemed ethics professor who's retired here and he has taught with us. So for everyone here, thank you so much for coming. And can you make sure for the students in my class that your name is on your sheet when you leave, that you write your name down? I'll put it in there. Thanks everyone for coming. And there's food. Please take some of those snacks if you're not an athlete.
You're fine.